Good evening and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry and I am the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. Hey, I want to share some concluding thoughts, hopefully, on Matthew 24:34 and the phrase, this generation. We've been showing you over the last several videos that there is ample biblical evidence and biblical support to prove that Jesus' this generation was in fact his first century contemporary generation. And specifically, it was the last generation of Old Covenant Israel. And what I want to do in this video is I want to prove that by doing a somewhat comparative study between Deuteronomy 32, Numbers 32, Matthew 23, and some other New Testament texts as well, and demonstrate that Jesus' this generation was the same generation that Moses prophesied to come in Israel's last days, and it was the same generation that Moses prophesied would reject Jehovah's inheritance a second time, and as a result of that, they would perish a second time in the wilderness. So, got a long way to go, like I said. Let's begin by paralleling Deuteronomy 32 with some New Testament text. And what I simply want to do here is demonstrate that the generation that Moses said would come in Israel's last days, that would become a crooked and perverse generation, was in fact Jesus's contemporary this generation. Okay? So, notice in Deuteronomy 32, specifically chapter 31:29, 32:20, and 32:29, it regards Israel's last days. Well, Peter and Paul stand up in Jesus' generation, and they tell their audience that they're living in their last days. That's Hebrews 1:1-2 and Acts 2:15-17. In Deuteronomy 32, in Israel's last days, the generation under consideration, that the generation that the prophecy referred to, Moses called them a perverse and crooked generation. Well, Peter and Paul in Jesus' generation called their generation a crooked and perverse generation. Acts 2:40 and Philippians 2:15. Deuteronomy 32, verse 21, Jehovah says because Israel had made him jealous by serving other gods, he was going to call a nation that was not a nation to provoke Israel to jealousy, that they might turn to him. Paul, in Romans 10, verse 19, quotes that text verbatim and applies that prophecy to his generation. And in Romans 11:11, he alludes to that text as well, which definitively means that the calling of the Gentiles through Paul's specific personal ministry was the method and the means by which Jehovah was making Israel, Old Covenant Israel, jealous that they might turn to him. Paul's generation, Jesus' generation, was the generation that Moses had in mind in Deuteronomy 32, which was the generation of Israel's last days. Deuteronomy 32, verse 35, Moses prophesies of a calamity that at that time, Israel's last days, would be near. Well, John the Baptist, he begins his ministry, he stands up and he warns his generation, which is Jesus' generation, of the wrath, the calamity that was about to come. Deuteronomy 32:36, Moses said that through Israel's judgment, he would vindicate his people. Well, we see that motif all through the Gospels and the New Testament, the vindication of the righteous through the judgment of the wicked. We see that in Matthew 21, Matthew 22, the parables in there, as well as Galatians chapter 4. We see that very, very powerfully. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 41, that the judgment that would come upon Israel in their last days would be the vengeance of Jehovah upon Israel, who would become his adversaries. Well, in Luke 21:20-24, we see the judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem and the nation of Israel as the days of vengeance and great wrath, Jehovah's wrath upon that people. And finally, in Deuteronomy 32:43, this judgment that will come upon Israel in their last days, upon the generation who would become corrupt and perverse, would be God's avenging the blood of the righteous. And in Matthew 23, 34 and 35, as well as Luke 11, Jesus says all the blood of all the righteous shed upon the earth would be avenged upon his generation. That is definitive That's powerful. The generation that Moses prophesied to come in Israel's last days, who would be judged for shedding innocent blood, who was a wicked and perverse generation, was Jesus's this generation, who was judged at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now watch this. I want to go now to Numbers chapter 32 and parallel that with Matthew 23. Because Matthew 23 and the judgment of Jerusalem for shedding innocent blood was the culmination of Moses' prophecy in Deuteronomy 32 upon that generation, upon that last day generation. So if Numbers 32 is the same generation, then we have definitively proven that Jesus' generation, this generation, is the same generation that would once again perish in the wilderness in Israel's last days. Now watch this. Numbers 32:7. If you recall, Moses warned the generation that had come out of Egypt, if they would once again reject following Jehovah and reject their inheritance, they would once again perish in the wilderness. Well, guess what? Guess what happened in Jesus' generation? The Son of God was crucified. He opened the gates of righteousness for Israel. He opened the fountain for the house of David, and they refused their inheritance. They refused to be gathered together to him in their second Exodus. And as a result, they would be judged. They would once again perish in the wilderness. Watch this amazing parallel. Numbers 32 verse 7. The generation that would reject their inheritance, they would be guilty of hindering Israel from entering into their land, entering into their true inheritance. Jesus in Matthew 23:13 tells the Jews of his generation that they themselves were not only not entering, but they were hindering those who were trying to enter the kingdom. Wow, what a parallel. Numbers 32:14, the generation that would refuse their inheritance, he says, that generation would be raised up in the stead of their fathers. In other words, they would act just like their fathers had acted. Well, Matthew 23:13 says to his generation, you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. In other words, they were carrying on just as their fathers had done. In Numbers 32:14, the generation that would reject their inheritance would be a brood of sinful men. Well, Jesus in Matthew 23:33 called his generation a brood of vipers. In Numbers 32:14, those who would reject their true and spiritual inheritance, Jehovah has said that they would, because of that, they would add more to the burning anger of the Lord. Well, Jesus in Matthew 23:32 said because of their persecution of the righteous, because of their rejection to be gathered to him, they were filling up the measure of their father's guilt. This is the filling up the measure of sin. And that was coming upon Jesus's generation. And finally, in Numbers 32, the generation that would reject their inheritance, Jehovah promised, I will once again cause that generation, that people, whoever does this, to perish in the wilderness. And notice what Jesus says in Matthew 23:37 through 38. Remember, Jesus was about to be crucified. This generation was rejecting him. They were rejecting his gathering of them to himself through the second Exodus that he was about to inaugurate. And as a result, they would be left desolate and they would perish in the wilderness once again. Watch this. Matthew 23:37 to 38. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks and you under her wings, and you were unwilling. He wanted to gather them together. That is Isaiah chapter 11. That's the gathering of Israel through their second Exodus. And they were unwilling. And he says in verse 38, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Well, that was the temple, sure, but that was the house of Moses. That was their covenantal world. It was being left to them desolate. And here's what's amazing. That word desolate is the Greek word eremos. It literally means a wilderness. Their house was left to them a wilderness. And because they refused to be gathered to him and receive their inheritance and enter into their true spiritual kingdom in Christ, their house was left to them a wilderness, and they would perish in that house. They would perish once again in the wilderness. This is in direct fulfillment of the warning and the prophecy in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Jesus' generation was the generation that would come in Israel's last days in fulfillment of Deuteronomy 32. They would reject their true inheritance again. And as a result, just like Jehovah promised, just like he warned them, they would once again perish in the wilderness. They would perish in the old covenant world that had become desolate and that had become unfruitful. And there they would suffer, and they would pay the penalty for that rejection. And they would be judged for shedding the blood of those who did enter, who did receive their kingdom, who did enter through that true and spiritual second Exodus. Listen, I'm way out of time, but this is the significance of Jesus' this generation. It has everything to do with Israel's last days, the end of the second Exodus. They're entering their inheritance, and Jesus' this generation, in the context of Matthew 24 and the judgment of Israel, specifically was the last generation of Old Covenant Israel who was judged for the rejection of their inheritance and who perished in the wilderness of Old Covenant Judaism. That is Jesus' this generation, and it only can refer to his first century contemporary generation. That's all I've got for this. We'll see you next time. We'll see you Monday. God bless.